I'm Won Peng, Go Won Peng. I'm a PhD student here in NTU, working on complexity and complex networks. Well, in light of the US elections this year, recently President Obama in Rutgers University gave this commencement address, and he lamented the rise of anti-intellectualism. He lamented the rejection of facts and the disdain of experts as being elitist. So I think it's very important for us in this room to realize that there is a growing, perhaps there's a growing population in this world who thinks that we are doing things that are irrelevant to them. And I think it's important that we address this issue.
Yeah, I don't think relevance is relevant. The moment we start to ask, is this science or that science relevant to society or to the economy or to anything else, I think it's the moment that we narrow things greatly. So I would put this question back to you or back to the panel or the audience. What does relevant really mean? As far as I'm concerned, science is in the same domain as art or as literature. And asking that be relevant somehow, I'm not accusing you of this, you just brought up the question, but I'm reacting to it. Asking that things be relevant to society would largely, I believe, have cut out the discovery or work on quantum mechanics over 100 years ago. It would have cut out all kinds of science. We might be wondering what relevance structure of DNA might have had, because in the early 50s we would not necessarily have seen all that led to. So again, for me at least, science is an art, it is a human endeavor, and it is something where relevance, I think, if you're lucky, comes afterwards. It's like asking again if Magellan or someone sets out with a voyage, what relevance that will have. So I think relevance is important, but it's not sufficient. It's an impoverished way to look at science.
Yes, I once said, or I quote a mythical person saying, the difference between applied and applicable, used often with science, is the same as the difference between the despised and the despicable. So if you know a bit about language, that'll tell you. I just want to point out several very small facts. Everything of importance since the end of the last war, 1945, everything in technology, in science, was created either by single individuals or by very small groups working in very open institutions. Nothing. The only big things that were done is they built hydrogen bombs. But that's the thing. But everything. So it is the question of that you should ask is the talents for doing this. They're all rather unique events. Just go through everything. You can just look at it. So the question is, why doesn't society say, look, what we'll do is we'll use 99% of the resources. I give lectures on this. It's called the Casino Fund. What everybody gives money for research should give 1% to the Casino Fund. Okay? They can do what they like with 99%. But who runs the Casino Fund? It should have no peer review. It should be given to people like me who, no, I've got experience. I've got a good record as a good gambler. I've won in the past, so you give it to me. If I fail, you're not worried about it. But it's even this, when I first gave this lecture, all the business people in the audience sprang up and said, how can we ensure payback on our investment? So I said, okay, make it 0.1%. It doesn't matter, you see. And the other thing is, and all the academics said, we must have peer review. Let me tell you about peer review. Peer review is regression to the mean. And in every subject, the mean is mediocre by definition and by experience. What you've got to get out to is 4 standard deviations away from the mean. Right, so that says, why do we view science as a great tax on society? Everybody thinks they've got a job which is productive and useful and relevant, but these scientists just want to have a good time and just sit around drinking coffee and other things and talking all day. But that's where all the changes come. So we're like, society is like the person who comes in with a gun pointing at its head and saying, you're next. So I think that we really need such a fundamental, has to go right to the bottom, understanding of what discovery, what invention is, and exactly how that flows into society from science. And I mean, I've lived through all those years. I published my first paper in 1945. So I have a record of being an active scientist for the last 75 years, or whatever it is, 70 years. So, but I can tell you that these are the same old discussions. We must do something. Why are we seen as such a tax on the society that is well known to waste tons of money, you know, large sums of money? Now you can't even count it, that it's in, you know, 10 to the Google, in fact. So why have we always been seen in that way? And I think it's important for the universities to really look at this very carefully in their structures.
I think that part of the reason why the public doesn't understand this perspective is that we haven't really communicated very well. We haven't explained to them, how should they know how science works? I mean, for them, it's like a foreign language. But, you know, it is possible. There are some of us who actually are very gifted. Martin is one of them. And I'm very impressed at how well the astronomers have engendered a real interest in the stars and the galaxies and, you know, these beautiful pictures. And I think that we could do a better job.
First, I mean, answer to your question, it's clear we should care about the way our work is applied. A nice analogy is that if you're a parent who've got teenage kids, you can't guarantee what they will do, but you're a poor parent if you don't care what happens. Scientists' discoveries are their creations, and they ought to care that they're used for good and not for bad. And so to that extent, the science have a special responsibility. I'd like to respond to what Sydney said. Peer review, I think, is on the way out because journals are on the way out. We have web servers and all that, so I think the role of the journals is getting weaker. So I think that problem is going to solve itself, to be honest, because people don't read journals anymore. And academics need to realize that the informal network and blogs and webs is going to be more important. But one point which I will put a gloss on, Sydney, is that some science does need technology. Obviously, my subject needs huge technology, but the important point is that there's a symbiosis between science and technology. It's normally said that you have the science, then the technology, but the technology then feeds back and improves the science. So it's not the linear model, it feeds back. And I think we academics need to be somewhat modest and realize that intellectual ability is a broader concept than academic ability. And it's possessed by applied scientists and engineers. And indeed, I'm always hugely impressed by those who actually make things and not just armchair theorists. And one of the cartoons which engineers like, and I like too, is one that shows two beavers looking up at a huge hydroelectric dam. And one beaver says, "I didn't actually build it, but it's based on my idea."
The short remark I want to make is that indeed what one should try to achieve by various means, and there are certain initiatives to do that, what we at Parmenides call fascination-based learning. I think this is exactly the missing element in most of our education. People don't feel fascinated. The subject is presented in such a way as it was tinned food, right? And then you think, okay, let's go to a nice restaurant. Yeah, but you have to demonstrate by the right novel means of education that in fact you are in an excellent restaurant.
Is there any difference to worrying about climate in the next century to worrying about being run over by the Andromeda galaxy in 4 billion years?
Well, of course, there is a difference in people's willingness to make sacrifices now for the future. And of course, no one worries about Andromeda because human beings won't exist. Maybe they'll be post-humans by a few centuries from now, because future evolution's not on the Darwinian timescale, but faster. But to take your question more seriously, I think climate change is something which could be very serious 100 years from now. And in my view, the debate about climate change is not so much between deniers of the science and those who accept the science, but it's concerned with discount rate and ethics. Because if, like Lomborg and the Copenhagen Consensus, you take the standard discount rates, you write off everything beyond 2050. Mm-hmm. Okay? And no one thinks there'll be a huge climatic disaster by 2050. And that's why they say that it's low priority compared to other ways of helping the world's poor. But if you think that in this context you should take a low discount rate and not discriminate on grounds of date of birth and value the lives of those just born today as much as those of older people, then you would think it's worth paying a premium now to remove a risk from people 100 years from now. And it's an ethical judgment. And I'd just like to put in a plug for religion here, because I was involved in the Pontifical Academy of Sciences meetings, which led up to the papal encyclical. And whatever one thinks of the Pope, there's no doubt that the Church is durable, it thinks long term, and it cares about the world's poor. And the papal encyclical, I think, had a big influence in the attitude of African, Latin American, and perhaps East Asian countries to the Paris conference by thinking long term. Another point I'd like to make is that if scientists want to influence politicians, they have a problem if they want to address long-term issues, because politicians clearly always have an urgent agenda and they are parochial, they think about their constituencies. They don't therefore listen to advisors. But what we can do to help is to make sure that the issues that we care about figure in their inboxes and in the press, because they care about both those. And that is why it's very important to raise momentum, and that's why outreach and publicists and popularizers of science and of these issues do have a role, because they can keep them up on the political agenda so that politicians can't ignore them and do think longer term than they normally do.
I'm Patrick Martin. I'm currently a research fellow here at NTU, and I'll be an assistant professor at the Asian School of the Environment as of next month. I was wondering about the role of undergraduate education in universities in this, and from what I've observed, there's clearly been a lot of moves towards making taking interdisciplinary approaches to education, creating interdisciplinary curricula, and I always wonder whether. Are we striking the right balance there? Are we maybe going too far? And in that sense, what's the sort of role of the traditional scientific disciplines of physics, biology, and chemistry? And how's that maybe going to evolve in the next 30 years? Should we be maybe not going too far in creating too much interdisciplinary education that leaves you perhaps without enough of a foundation in any one discipline? I certainly don't have an answer to that.
I'm Kimberly Klein. I'm an assistant professor in microbiology here. My thoughts that I would like to put to you relate to some of the things we've talked about. The very first comments from Dr. Brenner about the 3 M's and the fact that we spend all of our time in management really hit home, and I found that very depressing. I found that the last slide from the last speaker about where things we should be thinking about going forward kind of inspiring, and I feel like we're talking about the challenges for the next 50 years, but there are things that I feel like we should be doing right now, and it's unclear how I can make an impact and start to do things right now that will get us to where we need to be 50 years from now. And so I guess that's what I would like your thoughts and opinions on. And specifically, to get away from these issues of spending all of our time managing and not thinking about the scientific issues that we were trained to do.
I still feel fundamentally basic researchers, like even though as young as us, need to find a certain sort of methodology to try to promote us into the stage as you guys are sitting in. So,
well, just a bit of advice to the younger people, those who are still students here. I mean, about choosing a topic and specialization. Choose a topic where new things are happening, new techniques or new discoveries. Otherwise, you'll be trying to solve the problems the old guys got stuck on. It's better to have something new, and then you don't need to be cleverer than the old guys. You have better opportunities. I think that's very important. And also, everyone knows that there are some very, very important problems. A unified field theory, the origin of life, etc. But don't necessarily tackle head-on the most important problem. Multiply the importance of the problem by the probability that you will solve it and maximize that product. And that'll lead you to a different decision. Because I'd like to give another quote from the great Medawar, who said somewhere that a scientist who tries and fails to solve a problem beyond his competence will get, at best, the indulgent sympathy given to utopian politicians.
Good morning. I think it's still morning time. I'm Kristen. I'm from NTU. I have a background working in biological sciences, and now from 5 years ago I changed over to the dark side of university administration. And one thing that Sydney said very early on about the money, that's is what I was just thinking about, staring out the window at the trees. Over the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years, where is the money going to come from to fund and do and promote and communicate science? Where is it going to come from, and where could it come from, or where should it come from?
That's a big problem, and there I don't think there's any good solutions, given the fact that we're living in a world where there are so many problems, social problems that need to be solved, education, inner cities and so forth. But there's something that's happening which I think we can see the glimmers of, and that is, there are many billionaires that are out there now that have created their fortune while they were young, and they're sitting on trillions of dollars and don't know what to do with it because you can't take it with you. And some of them are doing some, I think, very forward-looking things. For example, I think your SETI project was funded by a Russian billionaire. Elon Musk, for example, is creating a new electric car economy. And I think that there will be more and more, and here's the problem. You're a billionaire. let's imagine, okay, who do you give the money to? How do you judge how to give it away? It turns out that it's actually very difficult to give money away wisely. Very difficult. Except to Sydney, of course. Where but it's a real problem, and I think that there has to be some way to help billionaires give their money away wisely.
I just want to come back to something what Sydney said, and I thought about it also beforehand. So, for example, one of the best schemes now for funding science in Europe is the European Research Council. But even there, I would say, they should, for the scientists who have a truly established, clearly established, excellent track record, they should just get away from these detailed, I don't know, two-level applications. But it's absolutely nonsense. They should treat it more like the insurance companies treat it, right? So you accumulate certain bonuses and maluses, and then they bet on you for the next 4 years, and then they see again how much it would have been much easier, would save a lot of time and money.